now I get to introduce someone who really doesn't need a lot of introduction in this room. But Yorchai Benkler is the Berkman Professor of Legal Entrepreneurial Studies at Harvard Law School. He's also a faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society there. He's held positions at Yale and NYU prior to that. He's gotten awards from lots of organizations, including Oxford and the Ford Foundation and Public Knowledge, the American Political Science Association, the American Sociological Association, probably some others that don't even make it on your CV because you're kind of polite about that kind of thing. He's advised numerous companies and governments and communities and organizations and a few students too. And I'm lucky enough to have been one of those students, to continue to be one of those students. And I think it's funny because I just sort of wandered into Yorchai's office one day, basically. Or really, maybe more accurately, I wandered into your inbox one day, and you happened to reply, which was amazing. That started off a relationship where I was working with you as a research assistant, and then that sort of transitioned into something more collaborative, and that happily continues today. And I think that there are, it's really, really rare, I think, this is as much for the graduate students in the room too. I think it's really, really rare to find advisors who are so committed to seeing their students succeed and seeing the people that they advise succeed. And I think that, I guess I think of Yorchai as having been someone who really helped me think about maybe 3 or 4 things that I try to do better in my work, and that is to think more carefully, to think bigger, to think and act more generously, and to not forget to laugh. And so, hopefully, hopefully that's something that you all get from your advisors, or that you can pass along to your students in the future as well. But please join me in welcoming Yorchai Benkler.
Just about the most generous hopefully you got that on tape. So I was asked to speak for about 3 hours. And what I'll try to do in this period is really 3 things. Very briefly, because we've spent a lot of time on it today and we'll continue tomorrow, talk about commons-based peer production, about its relationship to computational social science, and maybe identify a series of particular interventions that the set of techniques that people here around these tables could really do well and productively, or at least propose these. Second, and most of the time, I'm going to try to locate this work in a broader debate we're having today about the sources of income inequality in the United States, the UK, and across other places in the world, though not uniformly everywhere in the same way. And to locate both the literature on common property regimes and commons that came out of the workshop and Ostrom's, the Ostrom's work and their students, which we saw Charlie today with such a fabulous presentation, and the commons-based peer production work that we've been seeing in the last 15 years or so. How these provide the intellectual infrastructure for reversing some of the core mistakes that have led us to where we are now. And then I want to close with a little bit of a high level, what is to be done and how we translate what we've done, what we are studying into action plans for how to make things better. And so for different people, hopefully different aspects of this will be more directly related to what they think they can do and what motivates them. But hopefully at least the center part will provide one way in which I think everyone's work, no matter how specific it is, contributes to this broader project. So let's start with this graph that I've been using for 15 years now on the, I got a little bit of a scare here, I got a much bigger scare here, I got such a big scare here that I needed to add these graphs that show most used active sites and top million busiest sites. But basically this is adoption of Apache web server in markets, who's using them and how many servers. And what we know is that something that would have been considered impossible under the reigning economic models of 1995, which was that Apache would compete, much less dominate, the market for a mission-critical platform throughout 2 cycles of boom and bust, is in fact a fact. And so this idea of an existence proof of a different way of doing things has a force of changing debate. The force that came from the work of Lynn Ostrom and others in the work on common property regimes, and the force that has come from the fact of Wikipedia, from the fact of free and open source software, from the fact that if you have any claim to describe the world as economics does, you simply can't ignore it. And so one of the core significances of the success of commons-based peer production is the simple fact of success, effectiveness in the teeth of competing products from markets, from states, to actually say, pay attention to what's going on here. It's not a peripheral issue. It's not an anthropological study of gift cultures in Melanesia. It is in the core of the most advanced economies, and if you can't explain it, you do not understand the innovation structure that drives your own success, and essentially you're talking nonsense. You, in this case, primarily the dominant discipline of economics. Let me talk about three dimensions of commons-based peer production. One is as a transactions cost theory. This is the simplest one. This is simply the idea that as soon as core inputs, computation, communication, storage, later on sensing, are widely distributed in the population, you have physical capital as well as the human capital, diverse insight, etc. The other core input is a public good. What you'll see is that because of low transactions costs, and this is the standard and thinnest explanation of the story, that which comes normally to people, being social, having a conversation around dinner, sharing news we heard, teaching each other, moves from being central to social relations and peripheral to the core economies to playing a substantial role, economic role, in the production of the most advanced sectors in the economy, in information goods. Essentially, social interaction converts into a substantial flow of information goods. That's one class of commons-based peer production, which at this point does not yet differentiate from some of the other things we're seeing. Thank you. We'll talk about more in a second. The second thing is it's a certain kind of an innovation theory. And in this, it's related very much to Woody Powell's work and work on social networks in innovation. It's very much connected to open innovation. It's very much connected to von Hippel innovation. You don't think that's the appropriate term?
I think that's much better.
That's the term, right? And that's the idea that knowledge, wisdom, insight, creativity are embodied in people, are tacit, are sticky. Markets and hierarchies are lossy media because you have to convert that which that particular information system can identify, measure, and act on into something that is thinner than what people actually know. And so that pushes you into the advantages of social relations as ways of organizing people self-selecting through intrinsic motivation, teaching each other, I know how to do this, and not only do I know, I'm available tomorrow at 11 a.m., you aren't, in a way that's much harder to do with these fuzzier attributes of knowledge production. And so it becomes an innovation theory and the role of commons in the production of innovation, where freedom to operate, to experiment, to try, to adapt, to adopt, and then to share with others and reuse and remix becomes more important to the exploration of what is the project space, who are the people, who are the potential collaborators, no longer are bounded within an organization, no longer are tethered to who owns the set of resources on which we can act, but rather the set of resources is openly flowing in this commons. The set of people is openly searching for potential projects and collaborations, and these then turn around and feed the commons by using them and moving faster. And this is an innovation theory that, again, we've seen it in free and open source software, but it's not just about information production. I think one of the things that's been most fascinating is on Open Spectrum, where I've been arguing since 1996 that a commons can outcompete property because precisely it allows everybody to access this resource under symmetric conditions and experiment with new things. We've moved now in the last few years in smart grid communications, in healthcare communications, in inventory management. In all of these areas, actually, Spectrum Commons becomes the standard, and Spectrum property becomes the fallback, because there's been more innovation there for precisely these reasons. And finally, it's a political theory. From the start, free software, I wrote FOSS, but it's not actually open source software. This is the dividing line. From the start, free software has an activist self-conception that's about building an alternative set of capabilities such that those capabilities that are produced in a proprietary form are unavailable as sources of control and constraint. So it's a form of a libertarian or anarchist theory in the sense that it doesn't say go to the state as a counterpower to the market actor. It says, I'll build mine. You stay here, I'll go to hell and build my own set of capabilities that then provide the freedom for everyone, building workarounds that provide the degree of freedom necessary for people to bob and weave around constraints anchored in platforms. Out of these fall these three defining characteristics that Charlie put up earlier. Decentralization of conception and execution of problems and solutions is necessary right out of the innovation theory, because what you're trying to harness the insights and benefits of network innovation. It's about harnessing diverse motivations in order to overcome the lossiness of privacy, of prices and managerial decision making. And most critically, it's the separation of governance and management from property and contract, precisely in order to provide that freedom to operate, to make sure that it's not the boundary of the firm or the hierarchical command or the proprietary framework that gives you the permission to innovate, but rather that your ability to do so is negotiated in social relations with other people who also happen to be focused on this innovation process, on this creativity process, and can negotiate the decision to act. So this is how these three come out. What this does as a practical matter is help us map a variety of practices that have traditionally been more or less lumped together in various ways, but actually have very different things. So the first and most important is to separate it from crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing, most critically, you don't have task conception decentralized. You have it highly centralized. Usually you have task execution decentralized, that's the point. The social motivations, when you're talking about something that's for payment, it's not so important. When you're talking about something that's a citizen science project, it is, so it can be either yes or no. And governance and management are certainly not separated from ownership. And that's really just a transaction costs effect. It's not at all about open innovation. Online labor markets, like TaskRabbit, let's say, or like Upwork, at the more sophisticated level. Again, you don't have task decentralization, you do have task execution decentralized, but no social motivations or governance and management. Prize systems, open collaborative innovation among firms is about open innovation, but it's not about necessarily the lower transaction cost, because you keep it usually within firms. And this is obviously a 45-minute conversation in itself, so I'm not going to spend the whole thing. And then Mayo taught me that there's a real difference between firm-hosted and commons-based peer production, and that's important. But critically, what's important for us here is that commons-based peer production is the one of these models that has all four of these characteristics. And that makes it a very special and much narrower phenomenon than everything that includes all forms of online collaboration and coordinate action, particularly not crowdsourcing. What does this mean for this research community? At a bare minimum, what we're seeing is a diverse set of social practices that is absolutely central to how this economy and society runs its most advanced economic activities, that is available for the diverse disciplines to study. It's unusual in economic activities because the transcript is the interaction, and the interaction is the transcript. So the completeness of the data set on the behavior relative to situations that are observational, where there are more out-of-band. Now, not everything, people have out-of-band communications, etc., but it's much more complete. And it enables an evidence-based intervention in core areas of research that fall out of the definition of the phenomenon. Human motivation and cooperative human systems design, governance and organization. It's a new form of studying organization because of the completeness and the separation of property and contract from management, of questions of collective action, of innovation and growth theory, and of, particularly for people working more in law, property and commons as foundations of the modern economy. So if you look at some of these targets that are particularly, if now you're talking not about the broad framework, but what the specific project, what can I, as it were, as a grad student bring, that's a project that's part of this story, it's any one of these, right? You can think of evidence-based and intervention-based experimental study of human motivation without money. You can talk about the intersection of money and about crowding out. These are things that are measurable. We've seen some studies today. You can talk about governance and organization, about collective action. How do they work in firms v. peer production? So you have where's Jerry? You have data on IBM and internal collaboration in IBM. Is there a difference between how professionals collaborate within a firm that has a structure of hierarchy but is relatively open, as opposed to a completely open network? Those are things we need to understand if this is a serious mode of production, in order to know how to make it work, in order to know how to make it work better. Quality, the point that Aaron was raising in the talk, quality, knowledge development, learning. How does learning happen at the individual level, like Ulrika was describing this morning from this study? There's a way there to try to quantify it so that we understand how people are learning from looking at these materials that are directed activities at learning or at knowledge production. That allows us direct evidence to understand these questions of how knowledge is produced. The other thing that hasn't been so emphasized today, and I'm asking, not stating, and would love to talk about it at the end, is the extent to which it's correct to think of networks as a particular form of describing human systems that preserves the coherence of the individual network, of the individual node, the ability to change perspective and look both at the system as the whole and at the individual and individual variation and individual role. And that's quite distinct from other systems theories that see only the structure and suppress the individual. The network actually gives us a tool in which to understand the structure without throwing away the data about the individual. And the ability to look at the thing both ways is one that I haven't yet heard people talking about today, but I think has enormous potential. Because I think it's probably a mistake to understand human agency purely in terms of system, and it's certainly a mistake to understand human action purely in terms of agency. But being able to preserve both of those seems important. That was the first hour. The second hour. 1980 is an inflection point in the way capitalism runs. It's most clearly visible in the US, but it's not unique to the US. This happens to be the share of national income that goes to the top 10% in the US. And as you see, this is all from Piketty, building on Piketty and Saez's work. So if you look at the Anglo-American countries, it's fairly similar across these. If you look at the Northern and Western European social democracies, less so. If you look at many of the developing countries, the shape is quite familiar. And this obviously ignores within Europe differences between North and South, the emerging migration problem, the problem of youth unemployment. So this may be in some senses two positive a view. The fundamental point that's useful is to see that in all of these, around 1980 is an inflection point in how inequality works, and there's a real question of why. One thing to understand is that this is really, and again, I go back and use US data because there's been the most of it collected. It's the one I know best, and it's where the phenomenon is most powerful. I can't tell you that I know that this is true everywhere, but let's just assume for the moment that it's a useful approximation. There are two really components to this. One is the stagnation of median wages relative to the growth in productivity, which affects the median. The other is the sharp increase at the tippy top. This is the top 1% versus the top 5 versus the top 10. Most of the effect is driven by the top 1%. So you have a bifurcation that's really not a top 10%, but a top 1% phenomenon. And you have a stagnation more or less everywhere else, certainly everywhere else below the 90th percentile. So if we think of outcomes as outcomes that characterize the top 10%, 1%, 0.1%, this is the 0.01%, you'll see, again, there's a self-similarity as you go, as you dig down. This is happening at the very top as well. What you see in the 80s is that the 90-50 gap, the 90th to the 50th percentile, increases, but then slightly decreases and stabilizes for men, a couple of years later for women. So you have a brief period where inequality rises throughout the range, but whereas the 90-50 gap grows more or less linearly throughout, the 90-50 gap and the 50-10 gap more or less stabilize around 1990 and nothing changes. So imagine there are these three outcomes. What are the core practices driving each of these components? At the top, it's CEO pay, it's superstar pay, basically rock stars and a variety of such. And it's reference group pay. It's the fact that because this is what that CEO who's a real superstar makes, my status is the same, I need to get the same pay. For the 90-50 and for that flat portion, it's probably substantial increase in contingency on alternate work, diminished bargaining power, globalization and offshoring. At the bottom, it's unemployment and underemployment and low wages. So as you look, one of the things that's interesting here, how do we know this? The proportion of income to the top 0.1% that comes from labor income, that is to say, that which you get paid during the course of the year, given that you showed up at work, primarily in stock options in this case, really only crosses to capital income at the top 0.01%. Everything below that is primarily driven by labor income, hence the point about CEO pay and superstar pay. And this question of contingent, once you add contingent labor, increasing Gini coefficient across the OECD countries is also fairly well established. So that essentially what you get is that contingency drives down or suppresses median income. So essentially we have, one of the phenomena that we have is that a phenomenon that started at least in the US in the 1960s of increasing contingency, primarily originally focused on women, gets implemented in platforms that generalize contingent work across broad populations and across a broader set of practices. That at least is the concern with the Uber for everything economy. We'll get to more of that later. So what's the technological story? For about 20 years, from the early 90s until really maybe 18 months to 2 years ago, the dominant theory, I will get back to commons-based peer production, I promise. From the early 90s through about 2 to 3 years ago, the dominant theory was skills-biased technical change. The idea essentially was that computers made superstars much more productive. They were able to reach larger populations. They were able to get a lot more done with a lot less input from people with lower education. Therefore, their marginal productivity was much higher. They were getting much higher returns. And at the bottom, essentially, people were being replaced by automation. People were being replaced by the fact that their skills were no longer adequate. There were advantages to globalization and offshoring for standardized routine tasks, for manual tasks that weren't standardized and routine. The story here essentially is wages are more or less driven by marginal productivity. Marginal productivity has been changed by technology. Therefore, we see a spreading out based on skill. This was really a good fit for the data of the 1980s. Hence, it developed into a dominant theory in the early 90s. It turned out to be a really poor fit for that flat portion on the 50-90 that we saw in the 90s. So it was revised to a somewhat more sophisticated theory that took account of the 90s, but which would not have predicted what we've seen in the last decade in the US, which is no rise in college premium, rise at the very bottom, but not in the middle of the skills distribution. And again, we're seeing the theory change. So I'd say Krugman has written that the theory is now dead. That's probably strong, but I'd say that it's no longer as strong of a theory, which also raises the question of whether robots in the future are really a question, or whether what we're talking about is not technology driving inequality, but institutions driving both technology and forms of adoption, both practices and forms of adoption of technology that are about extraction and relative bargaining power. And so if we look at institutional mechanisms, we see the introduction of stock options, norms and experts committees, financialization, tax rates, and a variety of other things, increasing the rents extractable over here. And at the same time, we see weaker labor standards, deunionization, reduced welfare payments, expansion of free trade rules, all of which are pushing down unionization, pushing down bargaining power, and leading to a reallocation of the wealth, not actually primarily between labor and capital, but primarily between labor and management. And that's primarily where the money has gone. Interestingly, you look at the changes and they are independent of party in power. So the period that you have relatively lower inequality has Republicans and Democrats. The periods where you have spikes include both Reagan, Thatcher, and Clinton, Blair. There's no real distinction here with the shape of the change in inequality, suggesting that we're looking at something that's much more deeper in terms of ideology and much less about party in power and much more about basic conception and belief about the way the world works. And now we're about to come back to the commons and peer production. Basically, it's the ideas that underlie neoliberal policies. It's rational actor model, incentives, some of them at very high level of rationality and incentives, some much more specific like shareholder value or agency theory, ideas that translate into institutions that permit different levels of extraction of rents. The failure of collective action leads to the justification for deregulation throughout. The idea of efficient markets, again leading to deregulation in the financial sector, which drives this. So it's a whole series. And now I'm about to do something that is so weird that I even put grains of salt up here. So I know there are grains of salt to put up here. Engram. Let's imagine for a moment that we're willing to shut our eyes and our ears and believe that Engram tells us something interesting at a very broad and coarse level about changes in culture. Fairness. World War I, solidarity. Fairness. Rationality. Incentives. Rationality. What we're seeing is a period in which the terms rationality and incentives come to a point where they eclipse fairness and solidarity as a normal language. And these then can get cashed out. And again, by the way, look at the inflection point just prior to 1980. You then look at more specific terms. You look at agency theory, this is 1980. You look at shareholder value, this is 1980. You see a translation of these broad terms with a lag of 10-ish years or so into very specific actionable ideas that are not about give me mine, take you yours. They're about framing what is a reasonable view of human being. What are you going to do? Rail against the machine? That's who we are. If that's who we are, let's have agency theory, let's have stock options, let's have monitoring, let's have deregulation, and the like. This comes on the background of a widespread phenomenon of loss of belief in government success. This is essentially the rate of inflation in the 1970s, unprecedented in peacetime since modern economies emerge, that sucks the energy out of the idea of an expert progressive state. And this is the most speculative. I just put it in here. I'm willing to run away from it if you tell me I'm wrong. But I also think the left was busy. The left was busy on things that were justifiably important, but the left was busy. So this is labor, and this is the term women. This is civil rights. See the spike in the 60s. This is gender. See the spike in the 70s. This is labor. This is unions falling over time. The left gets focused on different critical aspects of inequality, but is busy on the side of income inequality at the same time that the right is working with a deep loss of belief in the state, and on the background of an understanding in terms of ideas that provides justification for a whole new set of policies. And so we get these pillars of neoliberalism. Uncertainty and complexity mean that economic planning is impossible, which means only prices in market can produce, which leads you to deregulation, financialization, tax cuts, focus on lower inflation instead of steady unemployment. Rationality as self-interest rolls into shareholder value and stock options and all of that. Collective action, we talked about with deregulation. Liberty depends on choice in markets, and property rights and market incentives are necessary and adequate to achieve human welfare. And then we come along. You know, facts, and damn facts, and a pretty good theory to back it. And it turns out that the core beliefs that underlie about what human nature is and how it functions and how human beings don't generalize necessarily. And there are plenty of existence proof that are wrong and decent theories to support them. And this is one of the interesting things is, if you look at the term the public good in American English and the commons in English, after the initial excitement about the tragedy of the commons, there's a loss, but then it's been growing throughout. So it's standing as a totem for a certain cluster of alternative paradigms that are essentially resisting, and this is what I'll try to suggest to you, resisting the paradigm of neoliberalism. So instead of the idea of uncertainty and complexity making planning impossible, etc., we see falling both out of the institutional analysis and development framework in the ecological commons or the Ostrom commons. Is that offensive or embracing to describe it as that, Charlie, as somebody who sort of grew up in that framework?
No, I don't think it's no.
Okay.
It's okay.
Local knowledge and diverse practices outperform rationalized models, both bureaucratic and abstract markets. So all of the studies of places in which well-meaning government tried to introduce pricing and markets and ended up destroying local knowledge and destabilizing local knowledge are essentially a response by saying markets are lossy too. Pricing is lossy too. And we already talked about, with regard to open commons or commons-based peer production, about the role of experimentation under freedom to operate and learning as tacit as the theory that's alternative, that actually means that uncertainty and complexity require commons and freedom to operate rather than necessarily property rights. Rationality as self-interest with guile, with separable motivations, and self-interest dominate whatever the other motivations are, is replaced by the idea of diverse motivations, intrinsic, pro-social, and self-interested, and non-separable interactions that determine action. So if you think of nature of rationality, instead of homo economicus with self-interest with guile, we're seeing homo socialis, diverse pro-social motivations. Instead of an atomistic conception of competition, we see a socially embedded conception of cooperation. Instead of tightly coupled system with well-designed mechanisms, we see self-direction, experimentation, ethical engagement in loosely coupled system. And critically here, instead of separable motivations with material self-interest dominating, so that if you act on the external rewards, you can solve the problem, which is the standard neoclassical assumption. You have non-separable motivation vectors that can work against each other, and you need to actually see how they operate in practice. if there was a core study question of the Ostrom School, it was the refutation of Mansur Olson. Maybe that's an overstatement, but I don't think so. Collective action works in practice. Governance is possible and widely practiced through socially embedded relationships. And the scholarship, and this is part of what I outlined for you as possibilities, identifying regularities and aid in the design of institutional and intentional practices. Less important. Property and contract are the sine qua non of efficiency and growth. We already talked about the role of commons. Property and contract are one tool set in an institutional toolkit. Commons-based governance is potentially superior. So if you just look at something like the Creative Commons, the set of ideas that are embedded in these very simple. So mine doesn't mean for sale. Shared doesn't mean erasing the self. Yes, it's mine, and that doesn't mean it's for sale. It means it's mine, and you can have it. We can have a robust system of social exchange that's independent of market exchange. We can build our own commons. There's a strong ethic of reciprocity underlying. It's not a collectivism, insistence on choice and self-authorship. In this regard, it's a fundamentally different kind of solidarism and cooperation than classic socialist frameworks that fell out of more collectivist models. Creativity, freedom of speech, and thought depend on a robust public domain. That's a very different of relationship of theory between of a theory of the role of property and agreement in the creation of innovation and growth than the traditional model. And freedom to own and contract, to pursue your own goals in the market as the core, and with Hayek's framework, regulation being the first step, the road to freedom. Instead, we're seeing positive autonomy, self-direction, free expression, freedom to tinker, power in markets as endemic as it is in the state. Neither of these is perfect. A form of freedom is freedom to do for yourself alone and in collaboration with others. So that together we have this idea of commons and commons-based peer production as a set of ideas that now allows us to translate just as a set of ideas that were the pillars of neoliberalism translated into institutional interventions that then translated into practices that ended up with the destructive cycle that we've seen in the last 40 years. The set of ideas about people being able to act collectively effectively, responding to diverse motivations, not necessarily relying on property and markets, but at the same time without being wide out. One of the critical things that's been so powerful about these schools of the commons is that they are deeply evidence-based. They are deeply skeptical and non-utopian in their view of what can and can't work. And they're done by people who've spent their years understanding that it's not that there is no hierarchy. It's different. There's no failure. It's different. And building it nonetheless as a degree of freedom relative to these other systems. So, the last hour. If we think of the future of capitalism as a potential expansion of things we already know well from the 20th century, from the notion of dehumanizing mechanization and de-skilling of the individual to the idea that robots will take all of the work and leave nothing for humans and leave us all begging at the door of capitalists on one story, or on the utopian side, everybody will be able to go and live Keynes's utopia on the beach. From the Never Never Girl of Kelly Girls to TaskRabbit and Upwork Everywhere, and from Brave New World to The Matrix, and the idea that should I offend you, Michael, with your colleague about Facebook experiment telling us that we can be manipulated to buy or not to buy, although I haven't actually seen data on buying. But the concern essentially that the quality of data on consumers will be such, and the predictability of behavioral response to platform manipulation will be such, that in effect, demand is so completely much more endogenous than it was in the world of crude things like advertising, we're going to say, oh, the olden days when we actually knew we were being advertised to, we could skip them. So what is to be done? And this I'll skim very quickly because it's very late, and I'll be happy to go back to any of it that people want to talk about. But basically, build a commons and provide public goods is one class of problems, and that's a class of problems that's relatively easy to work with from the data we already have. Because you're not talking about trying to make money, etc. The second question, which is a different hard one, is are there ways of leveraging our understanding of humanity and interaction through the commons, a way of providing opportunities for a stable source of a decent living doing meaningful work, as opposed to the extractive models that we exist? How much can we learn from the commons and from peer production on arranging these things? So this I already talked about, how commons-based peer production is building a substantial range of capabilities. I hear, Meiko, that you and Hai are actually going to be doing this study. This is an outrage. Calling this a sharing economy is an outrage. Right? This is a market that uses low transaction costs to allocate space. This is sharing. This is a place that rejects money as the form of exchange. How we build back the rhetoric of getting back the rhetoric of sharing, understanding how these things can work with or without making money is the major question. I want to do this and shut down for having a conversation. The critical challenges about which I don't think we have answers yet, and which are a massive question for real-world experimentation, because they don't exist yet, and then study as they're going along, is this question of commons-based peer production developed to harness volunteer effort, producing outputs that were distributed freely. If the problem to solve is not how to provision public goods that are available freely, but how to secure a stable, dignified living for the people who work there, then you're up against the problem that cooperatives have been living with for 150 or 200 years, at least since Owen and Proudhon. And that has to do with refining a source of revenue, paying customers, competing in markets, and all of the associated challenges that comes with that. Dealing with the challenges of worker-owned co-ops, dealing with the challenges of consumer co-ops and the differences between management and consumers, the problem of capture. These are details that I'm happy to talk about. This is not new. This is part of Marx's critique of Proudhon, that you don't just bring values to a market, you actually have to live with it. But we actually do know that values matter a tremendous amount. Do I want to do this? It's really late. Let me make two more points, ignoring what's written over there. Pay no attention to the text behind the man. We are not going to solve such a deep and broad problem purely by building peer cooperativism. If we can build a substantial portion of the economy, 15%, 20%, not out of bands for the most cooperative intensive regions in the world, like Basque Country, like Emilia-Romagna, that can influence norms elsewhere and create a political base. But a critical thing will be to also change the understanding of firms of what it means to be productive. That a core component of what we learned from the commons and cooperation and social networks is that economic production is socially embedded. That you are a better firm, more innovative, more efficient, by having intrinsically engaged workers who are actually part of a participatory process than you are when you're just extracting. There's an enormous amount of work within management science and organization theory that supports this. There's central to work in social network analysis of work of organization, but it's been overshadowed by the dominance of the neoliberal paradigm. Critical to change the way managers view, and there's enough play in the Joinsian market to actually have more decent and humane relations. That's also something that comes out of studying commons-based peer production and the commons. And finally, how we build in the state. And because Mayo is here, we need to celebrate. We need to celebrate Barcelona in the commons. However, being able to be skeptical about all forms of governance, the state, the market, and the peer production system, and knowing how to build intersecting and mutually supporting systems between them is a critical strategic study that we need to do. I've been grilling Mayo for the last day on what they're doing in Barcelona now that Barcelona and the Commons have won, precisely to figure out what a 4 million strong city can do in collaboration with collectives to improve the effectiveness of peer production processes. Another area of major study. Influence on politics and political engagement. This is a study we did at the Berkman Center on collaborative production. So what we need to come out of this research of ours is, at the broadest level, a competing idea to the one that's been dominant of the last 40 years. Its translation into management practices in market firms, its translation into effective peer cooperativism that produces steady, decent jobs that dignify their participants, its capacity to produce collective public goods without necessarily subjecting oneself to the power of whether it is a state bureaucracy or a market bureaucracy, and the capacity to create partner relations between the state and these cooperative practices. If we do all these things, I think we are going to begin to build an alternative to the slow motion crisis we have found ourselves in market economies over the last 40 years. That's it. I've exhausted you all. No one wants to say anything.
No, we exhausted them all. You're just.
Are your slides something you can share or not?
Oh yeah, sure. They're, my slides have a half-life of an hour. You just have to understand, I was sitting here at the table adding a slide in the middle of a conversation because of something Aaron said. So they are a snapshot of what I think about this literally now. But yes, sure. Okay. People want whatever. Jérôme, you want that? No.
I have a question. It's half formed still. Well, we can. We got one in the back.
I don't think I have it fully formulated, but
Yeah.
several years ago I went to a conference run by Tim O'Reilly that was, the headline was Government as Platform. And I've always been struck in terms of like GPS as an example of that, where there was this platform built when selective availability was opened up and the error was removed from the signal. Suddenly we saw this economy grow with all the car GPSs, Trimble, Magellan, all this. And the other puzzle I have about government roles is that we're not seeing collective action in areas where there really could be. So for example, in software, commons-based systems that are shared across cities, states, whatever. So what is the role of government in terms of setting a platform to create commons-based peer production systems? In your mind. How do we leverage that? How do we get collective action in government?
So I don't have good answers, for the simple reason that I don't know excellent examples. I think there are, I'm almost tempted to ask you to talk about what you're starting to think about now, but maybe we'll wait till December and you've had more of a chance. I think ideas have ranged from providing from procurement and questions of what procurement policies are. I think most of the thinking that has happened up till now has happened at the level of opening up data for purposes of various peer models of transparency and services. I think that's fine-ish, but hasn't really translated in significant ways yet. I think there are interesting ideas about trying to make government more participatory, so that essentially people can participate more in a meaningful way along the model more of participatory budgeting than of the let's vote or testify at town hall. But I think you're asking about something very different. You're asking about what is it that the government can offer that would actually make it easier for peer production to form and for cooperatives to form. And there, I don't know yet of particularly good models. So to me, that's a research question that I don't have an answer. Yes, now you want to?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, I thought you were going to sort of answer to that.
No. I have a separate question.
No.
Yeah.
So I think to me that's a research question, not something that here I have 7 examples and I can give them, these are best practices. Yes.
So you started off your talk talking about these huge successes in peer production, like Apache and Wikipedia and so on. And these are successful examples of peer production that have come with the advent of the internet. But at the same time, you also bring in this entire idea of like the culture of neoliberalism that's come up since the 80s and so on. And you talk about this culture of commons-based peer production that you suggest that we should encourage to sort of combat this scourge of neoliberalism. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing. So what I find, but given that the most compelling examples have existed online, but like, it seems that you want to like take these communities that have existed primarily online and sort of use them as a vehicle to transform culture in general.
Yes.
Not just online, but offline as well. And where do you see this relationship? Like, how do you see this correspondence happening? And how do you think, where is the leap that's being made? Like between, and is there something about the internet that allows this? Or like?
No. I think it's places like this. This is a superb question. Because what it asks is, you're making this claim about ideas and its relationship to politics and actual institution. How does that work? The theory behind this is essentially an elite theory of change at one level, in conversation with popular theory, with popular theories of culture. Take something like gay marriage. 7 years ago, President Obama said, no, civil unions, marriage, you gotta be off your rockers. Today, Anthony Kennedy says, marriage, of course. What changed? Nothing. Broad culture. Combination of elite popular culture framing, elite law / framing, some popular understanding through shows of, so it's not the end of the world. And then in that conversation, suddenly you saw a 5th vote flip. It's that interaction that I see this as potentially changing. But it will only do that if we keep doing what I tried to do today, which is to say, to understand it as that story, Right? If we understand it as a story that's just sort of peripheral and online, if we understand it as a story that's just sort of about silly cat videos on YouTube, we will fail to take advantage of this existence proof to convert it into a shared narrative, both at the elite level, and so you can have debates over what is a proper form of management, and at a broader popular level when it becomes something that people say, hey, sure, we should be able to do this together because they did it in these 700 other places. So that's the translation. Yeah, Peter.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship of peer production to what I guess I would call the social contract of organizations. So classically, even with more flexible organizational forms, organizations do things like provide health benefits, they provide some kind of education, they might provide maternity leaves and things like that, where people are paid within the larger context. I don't know of many peer production systems that do the equivalent of that. So how do you see the peer production system being able to capture and provide that aspect of the social contract?
So there are two very, very different kinds of answers that follow two very different potential historical trajectories. So one story is one in which, in the ideal, it turns out that the robot story is true in some sense, and robots also includes automation, also includes 3D printing, etc. That fundamentally we need actually very little human organized labor to produce a steady flow of goods and services. But we haven't developed an alternative system for actually sustaining all of these goodies. So that's the framework that basically says the next generation of, that's in some senses Keynes in the time of our grandchildren. Right? We move to a context where I'd say the most interesting idea framing it now is universal basic income. You basically separate the act of producing the flow of goods and services we need in order to thrive from exchanging labor in any kind of market relationship. You provision the goods based on whatever is the most efficient way you are. You translate whatever money you need over here and you give some universal basic income. And meaningful work doesn't come from contributing to something that you get paid for, but comes from making something that is intrinsically meaningful, like editing Wikipedia or helping the kids down the street learn how to ride a bike. And you just separate those two. That's the more utopian, though I don't think impossible. It really depends on how certain technologies of automation and fabrication change that we'll have to come up with something like that in order to have anything remotely like a politically stable society, rather than a society with a tiny number of people with massive investment in security guards and a lot of people clamoring at the door. The other, and this is the thing that I sort of skipped over because it was so late, was the idea that you essentially operate on these three levels. At one level, you build peer cooperatives. That is to say, you take the most successful instances of cooperative businesses. Over 200 million members of producer co-ops in the world. That's on the agricultural level. You can imagine a situation where freelance contingent work begins to look like that, which then combine a network of work outlets. In this case, if you take a model where you have farmers who share large capital goods and distribute together through consumer co-op groceries with loans from credit unions and insurance from co-op owned mutual insurance associations, you've got a framework that operates on a very different set of values and delivers all of those services. Those are sufficiently marginal in the total world economy today that you can't say, yes, let's throw everything there, and sufficiently large in terms of the roughly 300 million people in the world that operate with them to not be completely ignored. You double, triple the size and it's already 1 billion people is a lot of people. The second is what I was talking about here with regard to battling over elite conceptions of what a proper relationship in the firm is. So the model of the firm that you're describing is very much of an idealized description of how the firm was up until 1980. But the proportion of workers today, even at the highest levels, who are contingent workers, you have at the heart of Microsoft, some very large number of people who really are employees of a temp firm and will go in and out as they work. So that model of a firm has been supplanted by a model that basically is driven by the shareholder value idea and short-term returns that actually undermine that particular contract. So part of what I'm trying to do at the ideas level is renegotiate and refight that battle to say, no, actually, a place like W.L. Gore and Associates with 10,000 owner employees, one CEO and no other managers is one of the biggest, best firms in the world, and it's really interesting, and that's where you should be learning from, and then another 700 of these and the explanation. That's on arguing about recreating the model, using the social, using the ideas of the commons rather than the practices of commons-based peer production translating into the market. And finally, it's the side of the state and bringing the state into being a partner in all of these, which my answer was, I don't know quite yet how, but I'm waving my arms in that general direction, that's going to be a piece of the puzzle. Jen.
I'm trying to put together some of these ideas with your 2011 Harvard Business Review article, where, you can correct me if I misinterpret it, you seem to argue that many of the institutions now against which we would oppose peer production, those that support the Homo economicus, are rooted in basic assumptions about human selfishness. Mm-hmm. And that we've built these institutions that thrive because we still believe in the notion of the selfish gene mm-hmm. rather than the social gene. And if that is true, what are some ways we might be able to move from institutions that continue to support the inertial Homo economicus perspective to a more socialized view?
So that article in the Harvard Business Review is a chapter-ish, a chapter and a bit out of Penguin and Leviathan that came out a year later. And I think what I tried to capture there is the fact that actually when you look at a wide range of disciplines, you've just seen this transition from a self-interest focused atomistic explanation to a more cooperative model. It's very stark in biology, in evolutionary biology, where literally you go from Dawkins in 76 talking about the selfish gene, and we have to teach cooperation because we are by nature selfish, to Martin Novak in 2006 saying we might add cooperation to natural cooperation, to natural selection and variation as core drivers of evolution. But you saw it as well in behavioral economics through experimentation. There's a beautiful Lynn Ostrom's 1998 American Political Science Association presidential address. She goes through all of the literature within political science that shows the early instances of trust game and dictator game and all of that, and then there's all that literature. And at the same, 2 years later, Ernst publishes on fairness as an incentive, and there's all of this. There's almost no cross-reference between these two disciplines. They're all reinventing the same thing of learning that we had a bad model of human behavior. So to me, you've seen it in political science, you've seen it in economics, you've seen it in evolutionary biology, you've seen it in psychology, a whole range of disciplines that move. And when you say, how do we move? I think we move exactly in these forms of then translating it into management science. And there's a way in which, again, none of this is in some sense new. You talk about social embeddedness in organizations. You talk about the human relations theory of management. These all basically are translations of a certain conception of human cooperation into practices and routines within organizations that exist in the management literature and have existed for a very long time. Why they haven't taken over in the same way that stock options and shareholder value have? Option one, when you've got such a strong background belief in that, when people are essentially taught in their undergraduate education that what their grandma told them is false, what the experts tell you is mechanism design and self-interest with guile, then it takes a generation or more to clear through. The other is the Upton-Sinclair. It's very hard to persuade a man, to explain to a man something his job depends on his not understanding. If you've got a class of managers who are sitting on top of that increase in the top 0.1%, but continuing to believe in agency theory and shareholder value is pretty cool. The other is you actually get selection of who is at the top based on who is responsive most to these things. So all of these, I think, are mechanisms for which I don't have evidence. This is after dinner, we've had wine. I'm throwing potential stories for why it might be that something that has swept in the last 15 or 20 years so many disciplines has not yet been translated on a broad basis to management culture. Hopefully it's just a question of time. Brian.
So, because we're here among network scholars, I want to sort of get a sense from you that oftentimes we emphasize, we subject ourselves to a naturalistic fallacy. We go out, we study a social system, we find evidence of cumulative advantage and preferential attachment, and we pat ourselves on the back and say like, oh, it's just the fact this is the way that all systems sort of operate. We call it a network effect. We say that it's just the end, like as long as you can get these sorts of cumulative processes going, it becomes difficult to stop them. And so I want to pose the question to you, how do we sort of undo network effects, right? We prize ourselves here for saying like we understand networks, but how should we as a field go about sort of thinking, how should we make ourselves irrelevant potentially by how do we unwind network effects?
What were you saying, Peter? Did you have an answer? That would be.
Oh, I just said I haven't heard much talk of network effects there.
Oh well, I would resist the idea that it's network effects, right? So my own theory of social and political change is that arrangements sit within a series of multiple intersecting and overlapping systems that stabilize choice in substantial ways and sort of bring you back to a more or less stable setting. Then external shocks happen. I think one of the things, the internet was an external shock to certain of the practices that we saw, which is why we saw all of this developing, because it was moving too quickly and creating new opportunities. Can that feed more? So that's one component of the shock. The second component of the shock, I think, is the crisis of 2008, which to some extent destabilized. It was delayed, but I think Occupy gave the circle another shove. And I think that today debates over income inequality in the U.S., income inequality and contingent work in Europe are much more substantial. I'd say the World Bank has more or less retreated from Washington Consensus as their operating idea for development. So that moves that. I think the migration crisis in Europe is changing and shocking that system as well. So I'm not sure. What I've actually answered, let me step from the side of that. What have I said? I said, I don't know. But I think that the question is one of historical perturbation, and the question is diagnosing what source of exogenous shocks to these relatively stable and mutually supportive systems of institutions, behaviorals, social norms, technological affordances that reinforce the structure that we saw over the last 40 years get sufficiently knocked out of place that if we are ready with a theory and we are ready with a set of alternative practices and we capture areas that actually provide an anchor for a different behavior, the system can tip. And I think a lot of the work that I find so exciting and have for the last 15 years in this area is about building these real utopias, partly as existence proofs and partly as bases of political power from which to then start pulling at the day on which there's enough of a perturbation to open up the freedom to actually change things. But I agree with you, these things are incredibly, even if you don't accept a fully autopoietic story about the stability, the internal stability of systems, and you do think that there's room for intersystem effects and changes, you can still see some exogenous shocks breaking up these frameworks and leading to change.
I think
think we're out of
it's
time.
about 8:15, so I think we
Okay.
should surrender the room. So I'm really sorry that we. But thank you all so much, and please thank me.